Hey y'all, hope you're doing good today. So in today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you the story of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. And this is from the old book that I showed you guys earlier in another video called Tales from Shakespeare by Charles and Mary Lamb. So it's a collection of Shakespeare stories, right, or tales. And they are edited for use in schools, right, which is what it says. So I'm hoping that you will enjoy the story. It's actually it, somewhat long, and I've debated on just sharing bits and pieces of it, but it's really cool to read. And so it's kind of like the way that it's written is sort of elaborate, but at the same time, I don't feel like there's really any fluff in the story, any extra stuff, right? So I just really thought about picking through, but I would just rather share the whole story with you all, and I hope you enjoy it. So about stories, here's the thing. This was kind of like I guess an intuitive realization I had a while back recently, and because I've always been drawn to stories, and this is whether it's either in literal story form like literature or in art, because art tells a story too, right, usually. And so to me, stories have a unique, you might say, superpower. And here's what I mean. If you tell somebody something like a life lesson or a deep truth or whatever it is, just straightforward, like bullet point type conversation or communication, it may or may not stick. But when a person is listening to a story or reading a story or watching a story, right, or figuring out a story by looking at a piece of artwork, whatever it is, what you're doing, what this person is doing, is they're engaging with this work of art. And when a person, let's just focus on the story part because that's what we're doing today, right? When a person is really engaged, very attentive at a really deep level with a story, they are not only taking in the information like as would be in a conversation or a bullet point type list, but they are also emotionally engaged because it is a story, because there are characters and there are things happening in their lives. And so we have, it's like tapping into our ability to sympathize and to have empathy, for others. And so that is used in kind of like both as a hook, you might say, and as a means of really planting some seeds that stick with us, right? So there's something to be said about emotional engagement when it comes to information. And I just go back to thinking like, yeah, this makes total sense, because historically, throughout different cultures in history, shamans, that's what they did. They put on a performance. They would put on costumes, and they would just, have these elaborate dances or whatever. And a lot of times it would be shocking to people. It would kind of shake up their world. It would be very different than what they're used to. And so it engaged the audience in that manner. If you get your heart rate going, or your emotions kick in and they're suddenly involved, then whatever is communicated at that point, somehow, this is the superpower of stories, right? Is the engagement. Somehow the message sticks. And I think that's really beautiful and cool. And so, yeah. The other thing I wanted to share is the power of names and the symbolism in a name. So we're going to be looking at the different characters in the story at their names, what their names represent, what they mean. And I was looking up Shakespeare's full name, and as far as I can find online, he apparently didn't have a middle name. The closest that I found, and this is from, I'll drop the website in the description if I still have it in an open tab. I'll have to look, but I think it was a legitimate website. It was like shakespeare.org or something like that. But apparently his real name was, in Latin, I'm going to totally butcher this when I try to pronounce it, but it's like Gulielmus Filius Johannes Shakespeare, right? Something like that, which translates to William, son of John Shakespeare, right? And I know that a lot of times people's last name would be related to the town or the city they're from. And so I think that's interesting. It's like literally as a part of a person's name, an acknowledgement to their origin, either by family or by place. And so if you just look at some of the fairy tales and folklore that we have today, and a lot of them have been modernized. A lot of them that we think are new are just redone. I mean, I'm just reminded of the Bible verse that says, there's no new things under the sun. It's kind of like that. And so in a lot of these fairy tales, that's what the main character has to do a lot of times to complete their mission, whatever's going on in the plot. They have to do some digging or go on an adventure or a journey to find their origin, their family origin or their roots or something related to that. And so I feel like, as our names have changed, it's not as pronounced, in the way we name our children nowadays. And I think that kind of goes right in alignment with the fact that we are not remembering, maybe. And I'm just remembering, like, even in The Lion King, where Simba's dad says to him, remember who you are. Remember who you are. And so it's kind of like, that's something to look, more deeply into, right, than the surface level message. So, so we're going to be looking at these names. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to open by sharing a little bit about some meanings in the names, and then we're going to just go ahead and dive into the story. And after the story, we're going to be looking at more names, and because they'll make more sense then, right? Because we'll be familiar with the characters, what happened in the story, and we're going to see that, when someone goes through great effort to create any type of work of art, there's so much typically to it. A person who is in a mode of creation, it's like layers and layers and layers of meaning and of lessons, insights. And I think sometimes that some of these, and I can attest to this because of my own artwork that I do, I think sometimes that, the artist, the writer, whoever it is, they have a generalized idea of the story. And as they are creating whatever it is they're creating, there's another element that is flowing through this open avenue of creation, through this vessel, this instrument of a person, and it's adding its part too. It's the numinous element that comes through in the work. And that's what makes it really beautiful and gives us often a really cool surprise, if not multiple surprises. even if it's, you're the creator yourself. A lot of times you can look and say, wow, look at this. It's kind of like finding, something in the clouds. It's kind of like that in your art, but it's so prominent you can't deny it. It's like once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's just there. And I feel like that's, personally, I think it's like God putting his mark, on the creation process, and the ultimate message is we're not alone. We're not alone. And that's a beautiful thing. So I hope you're inspired to hang around and listen to the story. This is going to be much longer than my usual ones, but again, I just hope you enjoy it and get something of value out of it. So, okay. So, Shakespeare's full name, as far as we can tell, translated, it's just William Shakespeare. Again, he was a poet and a playwright, and I've already shared that with you all. William, son of John Shakespeare. So, looking up the name Shakespeare in the online etymology dictionary, it's recorded from 1248. It means a spearman, and this was, especially the shake part, was a common English surnames. So we have like other examples. We have Shake Lance from 1275 and Shake Shaft from 1332. And the means here, if you're looking at the latter part of the names, you have spear, you have lance, you have shaft. To shake meant in the sense of to brandish or flourish a weapon, right? So I'm kind of getting like the sword, like the spiritual sword of truth kind of vibes from this, Yes, so Shakespeare, a spearman. And then we have, to break that down further, we have spear from the Proto-Indo-European root spur, which meant spear or pole. Really interesting. That's a very common theme throughout history. A lot of meaning there. And then we have also the Albanian spar, S-H-P-A-R-R, meaning oak. So here we're tying in trees, which are also a pole-like structure, and related in a lot of myth and fairy tales as powerful. So we have this theme or this essence of power just within Shakespeare's name, alone. And he was an artist of words, and we know per the Bible that words are powerful, right? And I think this is very, very well captured in this story, which is why I want to share it with you all. So then we have the second noun listed in the online etymology dictionary for spear meant sprout of a plant and a church spire. And I thought, wow, if you just really are being very contemplative and you're just wanting to dig deep, you can kind of find a meaning that kind of ties all of these things together, I think. So, again, I wrote down, I'm getting sort of truth vibes, and I really am. So, I looked up sort of truth on Google. And I don't know if you guys have noticed, but now when you Google stuff, at the top, it'll have AI overview, which I kind of appreciate, really, because it's kind of like, in the past, you just have all these random websites, and you have a little preview of the websites. It's like, I'm not really sure which one to pick, and so just to have that little overview is kind of helpful. I kind of like it. So at the top, AI overview on the Sword of Truth, right? I had actually Googled Sword of Truth verse, because I know it's in the Bible, right? So here's what it said. It says the Bible mentions the sword of the Spirit in Ephesians rather. Y'all, I just woke up, and I've always been a night. Just a little short tangent. I've always been a night owl my whole life, till I had my kid, and then now, I kind of have to be on her schedule a little bit, and she just started school too recently, so it's like I'm trying to adjust, but I've got my coffee. So please bear with me. Yes. So anyway, let's go back. So it's talking about the sword of the Spirit in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 17. It says, where the Apostle Paul describes the Word of God as an offensive weapon. So it's like, this is why. I feel like Spirit put this on my mind and heart when I was reading about Shakespeare, meaning a spear man, and to shake is to brandish or show a weapon, right? And I was like, yes. So again, the Apostle Paul describes the Word of God as an offensive weapon. This is going to be related very much to the story we're going to dive into here in just a minute, okay? This is way too high. There we go. All right. It says an offensive weapon in spiritual warfare against the devil and demons, right? The sword of the Spirit is also mentioned in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12, which says that God's word is sharper than any double-edged sword. Yes. If you have, just a little side note, if you have ever been conned or just exploited or whatever, dealt with people like that operating in the darkness, and you caught them, if you didn't outright confront them, I can tell you this: they know what they're doing, they know what they did, and you can witness the conviction that goes on within them if you simply look at them and communicate a message that you know. You will witness their conviction. And a lot of people say, well, they don't really have conviction. And I understand that, because it's kind of like a person who has a conscience wouldn't do certain things, but yet you can still witness conviction. So there's something within a person that to me is proof that they know right from wrong. You know what I'm saying? And so that's kind of what came to mind when I was reading this right here. An offensive, because it's like the response is not one of regret or feeling ashamed in these people who operate in the darkness, but it's more one of fear. Because I think they detect, honestly, I think they detect the Holy Spirit within you. And so it's not you. It's not a power play. You don't care about that kind of stuff, you know? But if you're operating in the truth and they're operating in the darkness, then your mere presence sometimes can be offensive. Can be like that offensive weapon, you know? So I laugh, on this side of things now, but yeah. So we're going to witness the story of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. And so let's break down the name Hamlet before we get started in the story. So you have the last part of E-T, or sometimes it manifests as E-T-T-E, meaning an imitation or a sort of, a type of, right? Imitation. And I'm thinking again of how the Bible says we are made in God's image, kind of like that. And then you have Ham, the first part of Hamlet, meaning a village, but also home, right? From the Proto-Indo-European root, T-K-E-I. I don't know how to say that, but it means to settle or to dwell or to be home. So, after all this, it says, and this is all on the online etymology dictionary, it says especially a village without a church. And I see this not like, a town that doesn't have a church building. I see this as a group of people, a village, without a church, meaning there's no spiritual element there amongst them, as in the body of Christ. That's lacking here. And so that would explain the last part of the name, meaning an imitation, right? There's something in the Bible that says we can do nothing apart from God. It's kind of like that. It's kind of like people who try to just live totally via ego is one way to say it, or just totally materialistically. People who totally refuse to acknowledge the spiritual element. They're kind of like, we call it pretending or living like in falsehood or whatever, but it's kind of like an imitation of life. They think they're living. They may have a lot of material things and present themselves even a certain way and seem one way, right? But it's really not true life. It's imitating life, which is why Jesus refers to, living people in the Bible as dead, saying things like, let the dead bury the dead. They're already dead. They're just pretending to live. There's no spiritual fire inside of them. You know what I mean? So I think that the name Hamlet is kind of deep. And I thought that was a really cool name to choose. So, all right. So we're going to be seeing the struggles in this story of Hamlet and his approach to a resolution and the eventual outcome from his choices, right? So in this story, I hope that you'll find layers and layers of interesting things, insights, and more. So I hope you enjoy. Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. Gertrude, Queen of Denmark, becoming a widow by the sudden death of King Hamlet in less than 2 months after his death, married his brother, Claudius, which was noted by all people at the time for a strange act of indiscretion, or unfeelingness, or worse. For this Claudius did no ways resemble her late husband in the qualities of his person or his mind, but was as contemptible in outward appearance as he was base and unworthy in disposition. And suspicions did not fail to arise in the minds of some that he had privately made away with his brother, the late king, with the view of marrying his widow and ascending the throne of Denmark, to the exclusion of young Hamlet, the son of the buried king and lawful successor to the throne. But upon no one did this unadvised action of the queen make such an impression as upon this young prince, who loved and venerated the memory of his dead father almost to idolatry, and being of a nice sense of humor and a most exquisite practicer of propriety himself, did sorely take to heart this unworthy conduct of his mother Gertrude, insomuch that between grief for his father's death and shame for his mother's marriage, this young prince was overclouded with a deep melancholy, and lost all his mirth and all his good looks. All his customary pleasure and books forsook him. His princely exercises and sports, proper to his youth, were no longer acceptable. He grew weary of the world, which seemed to him an unweeded garden, where all the wholesome flowers were choked up, and nothing but weeds could thrive. Not that the prospect of exclusion from the throne, his lawful inheritance, weighed so much upon his spirits, though that to a young and high-minded prince was a bitter wound and a sore indignity. But what so galled him and took away all his cheerful spirits was that his mother had shown herself so forgetful to his father's memory, and such a father, who had been to her so loving and so gentle a husband, and then she always appeared as loving and obedient a wife to him, and would hang upon him as if her affection grew to him. And now, within 2 months, or as it seemed to young Hamlet, yet less than 2 months, she had married again, married his uncle, her dear husband's brother, in itself a highly improper and unlawful marriage from the nearness of relationship, but made much more so by the indecent haste with which it was concluded, and the unkingly character of the man whom she had chosen to be the partner of her throne and bed. This it was which, more than the loss of 10 kingdoms, dashed the spirits and brought a cloud over the mind of this honorable young prince. In vain was all that his mother Gertrude or the king could do to contrive to divert him. He still appeared in court in a suit of deep black, as mourning for the king his father's death, which mode of dress he had never laid aside, not even in compliment to his mother, upon the day she was married, nor could be brought to join in any of the festivities or rejoicings of that, as appeared to him, disgraceful day. What mostly troubled him was an uncertainty about the manner of his father's death. It was given out by Claudius that a serpent had stung him, but young Hamlet had shrewd suspicions that Claudius himself was the serpent. In plain English, that he had murdered him for his crown, and that the serpent who stung his father did now sit on the throne. How far he was right in this conjecture, and what he ought to think of his mother, how far she was privy to this murder, and whether by her consent or knowledge, or without, it came to pass, were the doubts which continually harassed and distracted him. A rumor had reached the ear of young Hamlet that an apparition, exactly resembling the dead king his father, had been seen by the soldiers upon watch on the platform before the palace at midnight for 2 or 3 nights successively. The figure came constantly clad in the same suit of armor from head to foot which the dead king was known to have worn, and they who saw it, Hamlet's bosom friend Horatio was one, agreed in their testimony as to the time and manner of its appearance, that it came just as the clock struck 12, that it looked pale, with a face more of sorrow than of anger. Then its beard was grizzly, and the color a sable silvered, as they had seen it in his lifetime, that it made no answer when they spoke to it. Yet once they thought it lifted up its head and addressed itself to motion as if it were about to speak. But in that moment the morning cock crew, and it shrunk in haste away, and vanished out of their sight. The young prince, strangely amazed at their relation, which was too consistent and agreeing with itself to disbelieve, concluded that it was his father's ghost which they had seen, and determined to take his watch with the soldiers that night, that he might have a chance of seeing it. For he reasoned with himself that such an appearance did not come for nothing, but that the ghost had something to impart, and though it had been silent hitherto, yet it would speak to him. And he waited with impatience for the coming of the night. When night came, he took his stand with Horatio and Marcellus, one of the guard, upon the platform, where this apparition was accustomed to walk. And it being a cold night and the air unusually raw and nipping, Hamlet and Horatio and their companion fell into some talk about the coldness of the night, which was suddenly broken off by Horatio announcing that the ghost was coming. At the sight of his father's spirit, Hamlet was struck with a sudden surprise and fear. He at first called upon the angels and heavenly ministers to defend them, for he knew not whether it were a good spirit or bad, whether it came for good or evil. But he gradually assumed more courage, and his father, as it seemed to him, looked upon him so piteously, and as it were desiring to have conversation with him, and did in all respects appear so like himself as he was when he lived, that Hamlet could not help addressing him. He called him by his name, Hamlet, King, Father, and conjured him that he would tell the reason why he had left his grave, where they had seen him quietly bestowed, to come again and visit the earth and the moonlight, and besought him that he would let them know if there was anything which they could do to give peace to his spirit. And the ghost beckoned to Hamlet that he should go with him to some more removed place where they might be alone. And Horatio and Marcellus would have dissuaded the young prince from following it, for they feared lest it should be some evil spirit who would tempt him to the neighboring sea, or to the top of some dreadful cliff, and there put on some horrible shape which might deprive the prince of his reason. But their counsels and entreaties could not alter Hamlet's determination, who cared too little about life to fear the losing of it. And as to his soul, he said, what could the spirit do to that, being a thing immortal as itself? And he felt as hardy as a lion, and bursting from them who did all they could to hold him, he followed whithersoever the Spirit led him. And when they were alone together, the Spirit broke silence, and told him that he was the ghost of Hamlet, his father, who had been cruelly murdered. And he told the manner of it, that it was done by his own brother Claudius, Hamlet's uncle. As Hamlet had already but too much suspected for the hope of succeeding to his bed and crown, that as he was sleeping in his garden, his custom always in the afternoon, his treasonous brother stole upon him in his sleep, and poured the juice of poisonous henbane into his ears, which has such an antipathy to the life of man, that swift as quicksilver it courses through all the veins of the body, baking up the blood, and spreading a crust-like leprosy all over the skin. Thus, sleeping by a brother's hand, he was cut off at once from his crown, his queen, and his life. And he adjured Hamlet, as if he did ever his dear father love, that he would revenge his foul murder. And the ghost lamented to his son that his mother should so fall off from virtue as to prove false to the wedded love of her first husband, and to marry his murderer. But he cautioned Hamlet, howsoever he proceeded in his revenge against the wicked uncle, by no means to act in any violence against the person of his mother, but to leave her to heaven, and to the stings and thorns of conscience. And Hamlet promised to observe the ghost's direction in all things, and the ghost vanished. And when Hamlet was left alone, he took up a solemn resolution that all he had in his memory, all that he had ever learned by books or observation, should be instantly forgotten by him, and nothing live in his brain but the memory of what the ghost had told him and enjoined him to do. And Hamlet related the particulars of the conversation, which had passed to none but his dear friend Horatio, and he enjoined them both, to him and Marcellus, the strictest secrecy as to what they had seen that night. The terror which the sight of the ghost had left upon the senses of Hamlet, he, being weak and dispirited before, almost unhinged his mind, and drove him beside his reason. And he, fearing that it would continue to have this effect, which might subject him to observation, and set his uncle upon his guard, if he suspected that he was meditating anything against him, or that Hamlet really knew more of his father's death than he professed, took upon a strange resolution, from that time to counterfeit as if he were really and truly mad. Right? So you following this? He's going to counterfeit or pretend like he's really and truly mad, right? Yes. Thinking, and this is why, thinking that he would be less an object of suspicion when his uncle should believe him incapable of any serious project, and that his real perturbation of mind would be best covered and pass concealed under a disguise of pretended lunacy. Interesting. From this time, Hamlet affected a certain wildness and strangeness in his apparel, his speech, and behavior, and did so excellently counterfeit the madman, that the king and queen were both deceived, and not thinking his grief for his father's death a sufficient cause to produce such a distemper, for they knew not of the appearance of the ghost, they concluded that his malady was love, and they thought they had found out the object. Before Hamlet fell into the melancholy way which has been related, he had dearly loved a fair maid called Ophelia, the daughter of Polonius, the king's chief counselor in affairs of state. He had sent her letters and rings, and made many tenders of his affection to her, and importuned her with love in honorable fashion. And she had given belief to his vows and importunities. But the melancholy which he fell into latterly, had made him neglect her, and from the time he conceived the project of counterfeiting madness, he affected to treat her with unkindness and a sort of rudeness. But she, good lady, rather than reproach him with being false to her, persuaded herself that it was nothing but the disease in his mind, and no settled unkindness, which had made him less observant of her than formerly. And she compared the faculties of his once noble mind and excellent understanding, impaired as they were with the deep melancholy that oppressed him, to sweet bells, which in themselves are capable of most exquisite music, but when jangled out of tune or rudely handled, produce only a harsh and unpleasing sound. I love the way this is written. I thought that's cool. Though the rough business which Hamlet had in hand, the revenging of his father's death upon his murderer, did not suit with the playful state of courtship, or admit of the society of so idle a passion as love now seemed to him, yet it could not hinder but that soft thoughts of his Ophelia would come between, and in one of those moments, when he thought that his treatment of this gentle lady had been unreasonably harsh, he wrote her a letter full of wild starts of passion, and in extravagant terms, such as agreed with his supposed madness, but mixed with some gentle touches of affection, which could not but show to this honored lady that a deep love for her yet lay at the bottom of his heart. He bade her to doubt the stars were fire, and to doubt that the sun did move, to doubt truth to be a liar, but never to doubt that he loved, with more of such extravagant phrases. This letter Ophelia dutifully showed to her father, and the old man thought himself bound to communicate it to the king and queen, who from that time supposed that the true cause of Hamlet's madness was love, and the queen wished that the good beauties of Ophelia might be the happy cause of his wildness, for so she hoped that her virtues might happily restore him to his accustomed way again, to both their honors. But Hamlet's malady lay deeper than she supposed, or than could be so cured. His father's ghost, which he had seen, still haunted his imagination, and the sacred injunction to revenge his murder gave him no rest till it was accomplished. Every hour of delay seemed to him a sin and a violation of his father's commands. Yet how to compass the death of his father, the death of the king, surrounded as he constantly was with his guards, was no easy matter. Or, if it had been, the presence of the queen, Hamlet's mother, who was generally with the king, was a restraint upon his purpose, which he could not break through. Besides, the very circumstance that the usurper was his mother's husband filled him with some remorse, and still blunted the edge of his purpose. The mere act of putting a fellow creature to death was in itself odious and terrible to a disposition naturally so gentle as Hamlet's was. His very melancholy and the dejection of spirits he had so long been in produced an irresoluteness and wavering of purpose, which kept him from proceeding to extremities. Moreover, he could not help having some scruples upon his mind, whether the spirit which he had seen was indeed his father, or whether it might not be the devil, who he had heard has power to take any form he pleases, and who might have assumed his father's shape only to take advantage of his weakness and his melancholy, to drive him to the doing of so desperate an act as murder. And he determined that he would have no more certain grounds to go upon than a vision or apparition, which might be a delusion. While he was in this irresolute mind, there came to the court certain players, in whom Hamlet formerly used to take delight, and particularly to hear one of them speak a tragical speech, describing the death of old Priam, king of Troy, with the grief of Hecuba, his queen. Hamlet welcomed his old friends, the players, and remembering how that speech had formerly given him pleasure, requested the player to repeat it, which he did in so lively a manner, setting forth the cruel murder of the feeble old king, with the destruction of his people and city by fire, and the mad grief of the old queen running barefoot up and down the palace, with a poor clout upon that head where a crown had been, and with nothing but a blanket upon her loins, snatched up in haste, where she had worn a royal robe, that not only it drew tears from all that stood by, who thought that they saw the real scene, so lively was it represented, but even the player himself delivered it with a broken voice and real tears. This put Hamlet upon thinking. If that player could so work himself up to passion by a mere fictitious speech, to weep for one that he had never seen, for Hecuba, that he had been dead so many 100 years, how dull was he, who, having a real motive and cue for passion, a real king and a dear father murdered, was yet so little moved that his revenge all this while had seemed to have slept in dull and muddy forgetfulness. And while he meditated on actors and acting and the powerful effects which a good play represented to the life has upon the spectator, he remembered the instance of some murderer who, seeing a murder on the stage, was by the mere force of the scene and resemblance of circumstances so affected that on the spot he confessed the crime which he had committed, and he determined that these players should play something like the murder of his father before his uncle, and he would watch narrowly what effect it might have upon him, and from his looks he would be able to gather with more certainty if he were the murderer or not. To this effect he ordered a play to be prepared, to the representation of which he invited the king and queen. The story of the play was of a murder done in Vienna upon a duke. The duke's name was Gonzago, his wife Baptista. The play showed how one Lucianus, a near relation to the duke, poisoned. What a break. All right, let's try that again. So the play showed how one Lucianus, a near relation to the duke, poisoned him in his garden for his estate, and how the murderer in a short time after got the love of Gonzago's wife. At the representation of this play, the king, who did not know the trap which was laid before him, was present with his queen and the whole court, Hamlet sitting attentively near him to observe his looks. The play began with a conversation between Gonzago and his wife, in which the lady made many protestations of love, and of never marrying a second husband if she should outlive Gonzago, wishing she might be accursed if she ever did took a second husband, and adding that no woman did so, but those wicked women who kill their first husbands. Hamlet observed the king, his uncle, change color at this expression, and that it was as bad as wormwood, both to him and to the queen. But when Lucianus, according to the story, came to poison Gonzago, sleeping in the garden, the strong resemblance which it bore to his own wicked act upon the late king, his brother, whom he had poisoned in his garden, so struck upon the conscience of this usurper that he was unable to sit out the rest of the play. But on a sudden calling for lights to his chamber, and affecting or partly feeling a sudden sickness, he abruptly left the theater. The king being departed, the play was given over. Now Hamlet had seen enough to be satisfied that the words of the ghost were true, and no illusion. And in a fit of gaiety, like that which comes over a man who suddenly has some great doubt or scruple resolved, he swore to Horatio that he would take the ghost's word for 1,000 pounds. But before he could make up his resolution as to what measures of revenge he should take, now he was certainly informed that his uncle was his father's murderer, he was sent for by the queen, his mother, to a private conference in her closet. But Hamlet would not let her go. Now he had her alone, till he had tried if his words could not bring her to some sense of her wicked life. And taking her by the wrist, he held her fast, and made her sit down. She, affrighted at his earnest manner, and fearful lest in his lunacy he should do her a mischief, cried out, and a voice was heard from behind the hangings, "Help, help, the queen!" Which Hamlet hearing, and verily thinking that it was the king himself there concealed, he drew his sword and stabbed at the place where the voice came from, as he would have stabbed at a rat that ran there. Till the voice ceasing, he concluded the person to be dead. But when he dragged forth the body, it was not the king, but Polonius, the old officious counselor, that had planted himself as a spy behind the hangings. "Oh me!" exclaimed the queen, "what a rash and bloody deed you have done!" "A bloody deed, mother," replied Hamlet, "but not so bad as yours, who killed a king and married his brother." Hamlet had gone too far to leave off here. He was now in the humor to speak plainly to his mother, and he pursued it. And though the faults of parents are to be tenderly treated by their children, yet in the case of great crimes the son may have leave to speak even to his own mother with some harshness, so as that harshness is meant for her good, and to turn her from her wicked ways, and not done for the purpose of upbraiding. And now this virtuous prince did in moving terms represent to the queen the heinousness of her offense, in being so forgetful of the dead king his father, as in so short a space of time to marry with his brother and reputed murderer, such an act as, after the vows which she had sworn to her first husband, was enough to make all vows of women suspected, and all virtue to be accounted hypocrisy, wedding contracts to be less than gamesters' oaths, and religion to be a mockery and a mere form of words. He said she had done such a deed that the heavens blushed at it, and the earth was sick of her because of it. And he showed her two pictures, the one of the late king, her first husband, and the other of the present king, her second husband. And he bade her mark the difference. What a grace was on the brow of his father! How like a god he looked! The curls of Apollo, the forehead of Jupiter, the eye of Mars, and a posture like to Mercury, newly alighted on some heaven-kissing hill. This man, he said, had been her husband. And then he showed her whom she had got in his stead. How like a blight or a mildew he looked, for so he had blasted his wholesome brother. And the queen was sore ashamed that he should so turn her eyes inward upon her soul, which she now saw so black and deformed. And he asked her how she could continue to live with this man, and be a wife to him who had murdered her first husband, and got the crown by as a false means, as a thief. And just as he spoke, the ghost of his father, such as he was in his lifetime, and such as he had lately seen it, entered the room. And Hamlet, in great terror, asked what it would have. And the ghost said that it came to remind him of the revenge he had promised, which Hamlet seemed to have forgot. And the ghost bade him speak to his mother, for the grief and terror she was in would else kill her. Then it vanished, and was seen by none but Hamlet. Neither could he, by pointing to where it stood, or by any description, make his mother perceive it, who was terribly frightened all this while to hear him conversing, as it seemed to her, with nothing. And she imputed it to the disorder of his mind. But Hamlet begged her not to flatter her wicked soul in such a manner as to think that it was his madness, and not her own offences, which had brought his father's spirit again on the earth. And he bade her feel his pulse, how temperately it beat, not like a madman's. And he begged of her with tears to confess herself to heaven for what was past, and for the future to avoid the company of the king, and be no more as a wife to him. And when she would show herself a mother to him by respecting his father's memory, he would ask a blessing of her as a son, and she, promising to observe his directions, the conference ended. And now Hamlet was at leisure to consider who it was that in his unfortunate rashness he had killed. And when he came to see that it was Polonius, the father of the lady Ophelia, whom he so dearly loved, he drew apart the dead body, and His spirits being now a little quieter, he wept for what he had done. The unfortunate death of Polonius gave the king a pretense for sending Hamlet out of the kingdom. He would willingly have put him to death, fearing him as dangerous. But he dreaded the people who loved Hamlet, and the queen, who, with all her faults, doted upon the prince, her son. So the subtle king, under the pretense of providing for Hamlet's safety, that he might not be called to account for Polonius's death, caused him to be conveyed on board a ship bound for England, under the care of two courtiers, by whom he dispatched letters to the English court, which in that time was in subjection and paid tribute to Denmark, requiring for special reasons there pretended that Hamlet should be put to death as soon as he landed on English ground. Hamlet, suspecting some treachery in the nighttime, secretly got at the letters, and skillfully erasing his own name, he, in the stead of it, put in the names of those two courtiers who had the charge of him, to be put to death. Then, sealing upon the letters, he put them into their place again. Soon after, the ship was attacked by pirates, and a sea fight commenced, in the course of which Hamlet desired to show his valor. With sword in hand, singly boarded the enemy's vessel, while his own ship in a cowardly manner bore away, and leaving him to his fate, the two courtiers made the best of their way to England, charged with those letters, the sense of which Hamlet had altered to their own deserved destruction. The pirates, who had the prince in their power, showed themselves gentle enemies, and knowing whom they had got prisoner, in the hope that the prince might do them a good turn at court in recompense for any favor they might show him, they set Hamlet on shore at the nearest port in Denmark. From that place Hamlet wrote to the king, acquainting him with the strange chance which had brought him back to his own country, and saying that on the next day he should present himself before his majesty. When he got home, a sad spectacle offered itself the first thing to his eyes. This was the funeral of the young and beautiful Ophelia, his once dear mistress. The wits of this young lady had begun to turn ever since her poor father's death, that he should die a violent death, and by the hands of the prince whom she loved. So affected this tender young maid, that in a little time she grew perfectly distracted, and would go about giving flowers away to the ladies of the court, and saying that they were for her father's burial, singing songs about love and about death, and sometimes such as had no meaning at all, as if she had no memory of what happened to her. There was a willow which grew slanting over a brook, and reflected its leaves on the stream. Willow trees are beautiful, aren't they? To this brook she came one day when she was unwatched, with garlands she had been making, mixed up of daisies and nettles, flowers and weeds together, and clambering up to hang her garland upon the boughs of the willow, a bough broke, and precipitated this fair young maid, garland and all that she had gathered, into the water, where her clothes bore her up for a while, during which she chanted scraps of old tunes, like one insensible to her own distress, or as if she were a creature natural to that element. But long it was not before her garments, heavy with the wet, pulled her in from her melodious singing to a muddy and miserable death. It was the funeral of this fair maid, which her brother Laertes was celebrating, the king and queen and whole court being present when Hamlet arrived. He knew not what all this show imported, but stood on one side, not inclining to interrupt the ceremony. He saw the flowers strewed upon her grave, as the custom was in maiden burials, which the queen herself threw in, and as she threw them in, she said, "Sweets to the sweet, I thought to have decked thy bride bed, sweet maid, not to have strewed thy grave. Thou shouldst have been my Hamlet's wife." Water break. And as he heard Her brother wished that violets might spring from her grave, and he saw him leap into the grave, all frantic with grief, and bid the attendants pile mountains of earth upon him, that he might be buried with her. And Hamlet's love for this fair maid came back to him, and he could not bear that a brother should show so much transport of grief, for he thought that he loved Ophelia better than 40,000 brothers. Then, discovering himself, he leaped into the grave where Laertes was, all as frantic or more frantic than he. And Laertes, knowing him to be Hamlet, who had been the cause of his father's and his sister's death, grappled him by the throat as an enemy, till the attendants parted them, and Hamlet, after the funeral, excused his hasty act in throwing himself into the grave as if to brave Laertes. But he said he could not bear that anyone should seem to outgo him in grief for the death of the fair Ophelia, and for the time these two noble youths seemed reconciled. But out of the grief and anger of Laertes for the death of his father and Ophelia, the king, Hamlet's wicked uncle, contrived destruction for Hamlet. He set on Laertes, under a cover of peace and reconciliation, to challenge Hamlet to a friendly trial of skill at fencing, which Hamlet accepting, a day was appointed to try the match. At this match all the court was present, and Laertes, by direction of the king, prepared a poisoned weapon. Upon this match great wagers were laid by the courtiers, as both Hamlet and Laertes were known to excel at the sword play, and Hamlet, taking up the foils, chose one, not at all suspecting the treachery of Laertes, or being careful to examine Laertes' weapon, who, instead of a foil or blunted sword, which the laws of fencing require, made use of one with a point and poisoned. At first Laertes did but play with Hamlet, and suffered him to gain some advantages, which the dissembling king magnified and extolled beyond measure, drinking to Hamlet's success, and wagering rich bets upon the issue. But after a few pauses, Laertes, growing warm, made a deadly thrust at Hamlet with his poisoned weapon, and gave him a mortal blow. Hamlet, incensed, but not knowing the whole of the treachery in the scuffle, exchanged his own innocent weapon for Laertes' deadly one, and with a thrust of Laertes' own sword repaid Laertes home, who was thus justly caught in his own treachery. In this instant the queen shrieked out that she was poisoned. She had inadvertently drunk out of a bowl which the king had prepared for Hamlet, in case, that being warm in fencing, he should call for a drink. Into this the treacherous king had infused a deadly poison to make sure of Hamlet, if Laertes had failed. He had forgotten to warn the queen of the bowl, which she drank of, and immediately died, exclaiming with her last breath that she was poisoned. Hamlet, suspecting some treachery, ordered the doors to be shut while he sought it out. Laertes told him to seek no further, for he was the traitor, and feeling his life go away with the wound which Hamlet had given him, he made confession of the treachery he had used, and how he had fallen a victim to it. And he told Hamlet of the envenomed point, and said that Hamlet had not half an hour to live, for no medicine could cure him. And begging forgiveness of Hamlet, he died, with his last words, accusing the king of being the contriver of the mischief. When Hamlet saw his end draw near, there being yet some venom left upon the sword, he suddenly turned upon his false uncle, and thrust the point of it to his heart, fulfilling the promise which he had made to his father's spirit, whose injunction was now accomplished, and his foul murder revenged upon the murderer. Then Hamlet, feeling his breath fail and life departing, turned to his dear friend Horatio, who had been spectator of this fatal tragedy, and with his dying breath requested him that he would live to tell his story to the world, for Horatio had made a motion as if he would slay himself to accompany the prince in death, and Horatio promised that he would make a true report as one that was privy to all the circumstances. And thus, satisfied, the noble heart of Hamlet cracked, and Horatio and the bystanders, with many tears, commended the spirit of this sweet prince to the guardianship of angels. For Hamlet was a loving and a gentle prince, and greatly beloved for his many noble and prince-like qualities. and if he had lived, would no doubt have proved a most royal and complete king to Denmark. So I hope you enjoyed that story. It really piqued my interest in Shakespeare, and so I'm looking forward to reading some of the others, and or all of them. But let's talk about some of these other names now that we kind of know what happened in the story, because I think it's no coincidence, But before we do that, I would just say, and this, like I was saying in the beginning of this video, this is the magic, or just the superpower of stories, is that one person can take, this meaning away from it, this lesson away from it. This person can have a totally different, or can get a totally different impression and take away than this person. And then, it's one of those things that lingers. The story, it gets absorbed. And we just sort of like, I think our subconscious processes it, and then that's why later, weeks later, months later, even years later, you can remember a certain part of the story. It's kind of like, I've mentioned this before, I feel like our mind is like this big computer, and it's just constantly running, and then like these insights just sort of, or realizations rather, that they kind of just like tabulate or something, and they pop up into our conscious awareness at various points. And stories are like that. It's like just a big download for our mind to chew on and to work on. And so, but I think that the most obvious takeaway is that I'm losing the word. I've totally lost the word. Revenge. Yeah. Not a good thing. Not a good thing. And so what also is interesting is we see the part that of like the theme of revenge that happened seemingly by chance, right? Where Hamlet's mother accidentally, drank from the poisoned cup. But what was interesting is the ghost said to Hamlet to leave his mother to like the court of the heavens. In other words, he didn't want Hamlet to intentionally impose any kind of revenge on her. And so that's actually what wound up happening, if you look at it that way. It's kind of like, was it by chance, or was it like a spiritual thing, destiny for her, like karma, you know what I mean, coming back on his mother. So kind of interesting. The other thing that I noticed is, he had enough sense about him, Hamlet did, to question if this ghost was truly his father or not. And he wondered if it could possibly be the devil in disguise. And you see how the story played out. So there was a movie made, and I don't really remember the movie, but they made a TV series that was very similar to the movie, and I can't remember it right now. I can see the actor that plays in it. I'll drop all this down in the description. But it was set like way up in a northern town, and there was a man who had a really cruel wife, and I mean, she was just really mean to this man. And the stranger came into town and tempted this man to murder his wife. And that's what happened. And then it was just like a snowball effect from there. So it reminds me of that. And so the insinuation in the show was that the stranger that came to town was Satan himself. And so I'm just, reading the story makes me recall that story. God, I think it had the word north in it, or northern something, or I don't know. It's like when you need to recall something, you can't. And then when you're just minding your business, you have random things pop in your head. Um, but I'm sure I'll think of it and I'll put it in the description here in a little bit. So we could break this story down so many different ways. Again, there's layers, but I'll just to keep this from being 10 hours long and taking 2 weeks to upload. I'll try to whittle it down to just some important points that really stood out to me. Um, so let's take a look at the names, the meanings of the names. So it opens, the story opens talking about his mother, and her name is Gertrude, and this is from the Old High German Gertrudis, right? And it's from Ger, meaning spear. So here we have, just like Shakespeare's own name, the author, we have another reference to spear, which I find really interesting. And then you have Tret, from Gertrude, Ger, and Tret, meaning beloved or dear. Okay, and then we have Claudius. Remember, Claudius was Hamlet's uncle, the murderer, right, of his father. And I thought this was cool. It's from Claudus, meaning lame. And then we have Ophelia, which was Hamlet's love, right, which met a tragic ending, from the Greek Ophelia, but just spelled a little bit different, meaning help or aid. So like a helper. And then we have Polonius, who was Ophelia's father, and the one who hid in the closet to listen to the private conversation between Hamlet and his mother. Polonius. So I couldn't find anything specific on his name, but what was interesting is, if you break up the name, you have Polo of Polonius, meaning ball, right? And specifically in relation to a game, and I think that part's relevant. And then you have the latter part of the name, Polonius, you have Neus, related to Nous, meaning intelligence, wit, or cleverness. So a game of cunning, and that was exactly what his character was feeling, and the motivation to actually comply with what the king had asked him to do, to hide in the closet. Remember, he was kind of tired of the old state of affairs, just kind of like the boring repetition of his position in working for the king. So he was kind of like excited a little bit. It sort of insinuated that, that he got to play this game, to be clever and hide away and listen in. And then what was really interesting is, in looking up the word Nous, there's a phrase called entre nous, or nous, meaning in private or between ourselves. So there was a sense of privacy, remembering that he was hiding. So I thought that was cool. And you wonder if these names were chosen on purpose or not, or if it just came to Shakespeare's mind, if this was inspiration. To me, there's you can experience confirmations from the spiritual realm when you have like an inspiration to include a certain name, as in this example, and then later you find out that what you thought was a random name you chose fit the scene perfectly. So if this wasn't Shakespeare's intention, then to me that's just confirmation that there's something more at work in the creation process. So apparently what happened when Hamlet devised and implemented this play for the king to watch, right? The story of Hamlet itself is a play. And so we're witnessing a play within a play. So it's interesting that this actually has a name. It's called a mousetrap, right? A play within a play. But it's also applicable here anyway, because that's what Hamlet is doing to his uncle. He's trapping him. Anyway. So let's take a look at some more names. We have Gonzago, who was in the play that Hamlet created. to get confirmation. He was watching his uncle to see if he would react, if there was a little ping of conscience, and there was a great ping of conscience. See, so Gonzaga was playing Claudius in this play. I'm sorry, I take that back. Gonzaga was playing Hamlet's dead father. Okay, and AI online told me that this name Gonzaga, means battle. Battle. Remember that Hamlet Senior, the king who was killed, he was a leader, and he was often seen in armor. So very much related. And then Gonzaga's wife was Baptista in the play, who represented Gertrude, Hamlet's mother. And the name Baptista is in reference to baptism, right? To dip. Or you might say to die to your old self and be reborn, and in the end she was in fact killed. So a lot of this stuff can be seen metaphorically too. There's some just very obvious good life lessons in here, and then too, if you look at it a certain way, through a certain perception filter or lens, you can see this is where the layers come in. You can see like a spiritual side and story to it. And then what was really interesting is the character who played Claudius in this play that Hamlet made was named Lucianus, and that means light in Latin. Well, we know that who's referred to as the angel of light in the Bible is the devil. All right. So what really stuck out what really got my attention when I was looking at these names and just kind of thinking about how everything played out was we're seeing the same overarching theme again of the hero's journey, just a little bit different. So we have the same story of an orphan, right? There's a struggle with a parent or a step-parent, which is very common in these stories. There's a helper present, Ophelia, she's the helper. And then when Polonius is accidentally killed, it has a ripple effect of killing Ophelia, right? So a lot of times the parent's killed off, or the helper is killed off. There's a game of mind, of perception, of wit, right, for the hero, represented by the character of Polonius. You might look at it that way. Now what's interesting is Ophelia, and it's flat out explained this way too in the story, but Ophelia is what keeps the main character, the hero, Hamlet, grounded. She keeps Hamlet grounded. Excuse me. And what is it about her characteristics that keeps Hamlet grounded? She represents all that is good and true. She represents the spirit of love, and just all the good things, right? And that keeps him, again, rooted and grounded. Now, what tempts Hamlet to go down the dark path? It's the ghost of his father, right? Which he's not real sure if it's really the ghost of his father or the devil in disguise. Okay, I bet in hindsight he sees it differently. But the Old English of ghost is gast, G-A-S-T, meaning breath, good or bad spirit, angel, demon, person, man, human being. And in biblical use, the soul, the spirit, and life itself. So what was interesting is the Old English, Sanskrit, root of the word ghost is Hedah, H-E-D-A-H, meaning wrath. And that was what the ghost was prompting or inciting within the soul and the spirit of Hamlet. He was inciting revenge, out of wrath, right? Anger. And then what's also interesting is from the Old English, we have the Old English Gaestan, G-A-E-S-T-A-N, also related to ghost, meaning to frighten. So here we have two elements, which so weird because I just filmed this, I think, in my very last video. I was talking about two of the main things. Well, I think I said fear and confusion, that are tools that a manipulator, someone operating in the darkness, can implement on their victim. They can get them to be afraid, they can confuse them. But here we have fear also, and anger. Now, I would certainly say confusion was a big part of this. I mean, throughout the whole story, Hamlet's trying to figure things out. He's very confused about things. So it's just, if you're looking at motivating feelings, motivating states of being, really, it's more than just a feeling. Motivating spirits, I would say they're definitely present here, and they are fear, anger, and confusion. So, and these act as, when a person engages in these states of being or embodies these states of being and takes them on. Remember, we're told in the Bible to rebuke bad thoughts. We're supposed to reject these bad influential thoughts that come our way, okay? And so when a person doesn't do that, when they take them on and latch on, then they become like this spirit personified in the ghost in this story. They act as a hook to then pull one into a state of temptation and provocation to do bad things, as exemplified in the story of Hamlet and as exemplified in this movie I'm trying to recall and I can't remember the name. So, yes. So Ophelia's brother, trying to read my writing, y'all. Ophelia's brother was named Laertes, right? And this means literally in Greek, the gatherer of the people. And I find that interesting that he was in the grave, and he, by his crying out, his words and actions and essence of mourning was like a lure to Hamlet to come down in the gravesite with him, and then what commenced was Hamlet being killed. So interesting that he was named Laertes, gatherer of the people. Laos, meaning people, and then you have iron for the latter part of Laertes, meaning to fasten together. And then what's really, really, I was like, this is incredible. The other meaning, besides to gather together or to fasten together people, is to speak or to say. Here we have another reference to this sort of truth in relation to the word. The word. So, if you wanted to take this down a different route, you could look at how this parallels to Jesus, and so many different ways you could branch this out. So yes, joining in words and or actions. So in the end, Hamlet joined Laertes in the grave, right? And we see this complete cycle. If you look at the characters as representations of different stages in one's life and things like that, we do have a complete cycle. Typically, the hero's journey is a circular or a complete cycle from life to life, and with there being like a death and resurrection down here in the underworld, and coming back to life. But this cycle seems to be from death to death, which is interesting. So if you wanted to really dig down deep and pick this apart, it might be really fun. So the literal cycle presented before us is death to death. But metaphorically, if you looked at it that way, you could look at it again through the lens of the hero's journey, which is he began as an orphan. He struggled with his mind, and the struggle could be represented by Ophelia versus the ghost. The ghost would be fear and anger and confusion. Ophelia is love and all the good things that we need to truly consciously stay attached to and not let go of. There was a loss of innocence. Ophelia was this fair maiden. She died. There's always a loss of innocence, of naivety in these stories. And then at the end of the cycle, there's a completion or a homecoming, completion of a spiritual cycle, a homecoming. Again, because where is it? Something, one of these names meant home. And it's not Laertes, ironically. Oh, Hamlet. Yeah, Hamlet. That name is to be home, right? And Ham especially is a village without a church. So, but yeah, there's a homecoming, right? So, just a lot to unpack, a lot to explore, which is always fun. And I just hope that you enjoyed the story. I hope that you enjoyed just thinking about all these things, and I hope that it enriched your life in some way. I thank you so much for coming on to hear the message, and I hope that you have a beautiful day, and I will see you again very soon.